So, welcome, guys. We have about 40 minutes left in our afternoon, and what I wanted to do is just to hear some of the war stories from the field. If you can maybe think about some of your most interesting deployment scenarios that you've run into as we've tested this idea, to kind of run through the list and hear some of the things that you've done out there. So, Chris, why don't we start with you on this one?
Got your right number? Hello? Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, so let me start. The example I think we'll put forward. We've been working with power utilities, energy companies, and in fact we've been working on energy companies. I think there's been things out in the press about some of the work that we've done with private LTE in that space. One of the things that we found is that when we got in there, I think there's a preconception about what you need to deal with private utility, the energy companies and so on, and some of it is around the command and control of the utility itself. And I think when you come to that, clearly there's a bias to try and go for licensed spectrum. The amount of spectrum that they need can be fairly small. It can be 5 megahertz or whatever. But what we found is that in addition to that, there started to come out use cases, especially around the install and the maintenance of these systems, where higher bandwidth applications became really clear. And in particular, what we found is that things like preventative maintenance in places like wind farms and so on, where if you let the whole thing go to a point you get catastrophic failure, the cost is huge. So the implementation of networks that can actually create that preventative maintenance or that warning about a failure turned out to be a really interesting one. The other part of it was that when you got into the deployment itself and you got you guys out, and they're out in fairly remote locations, is that if you add things like video assistance and so on to any of the install, you start to take away some of the problems that have occurred just through day-to-day operations as they do that. So what we found is that it's an industry where it's great for us because you can stitch together maybe some low band sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, small narrow band spectrum that you could actually use for say command and control and some of the things that they do with the SCADA network, with, say, the CBRS, and start to address some of the problems with higher bandwidth issues around the whole operation, maintenance and control, or maintenance and preventative maintenance of the systems. So, from our perspective, what that did is it said that, okay, there's a need to, there's clearly a business need where you can put in LTE networks, and that some of those get addressed with, as I say, some of the low-end spectrum with the command control SCADA networks. But once you've got that in, and once you've got that infrastructure in, bringing in CBRS on the top, which in the main can utilize most of those assets, you actually then can bring some of these other use cases. And I think that clearly people go out and deploy these networks as they are today, and they do things around just to get around some of that. But there are real simple things that we found, like the fact that sometimes they get false alarms in terms of doors at stations, where a door may get banged by even a wild animal or whatever. And it would be useful to understand if you could trigger a view as to whether in fact it was an intrusion or whether it was an accident. And those are the types of things that I think we've come up, is that if you can stitch together the spectrum, you can provide an overall network view, plus you can add on some of the intelligence that they need to operate it, then you're really creating a lot of value. And certainly a lot of the experience we've had, not just here in the US, but in other parts of the world on dealing with these power utilities and so on, says that once you can get into that mode and once you've got that fundamental infrastructure in there, there's quite a large sort of envelope of use cases that start to emerge just as you get into the day-to-day operations.
Oh, good stuff. Thanks, Chris. Paul.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Challoner from Ericsson. I'm responsible for the Ericsson radio portfolio in North America. And I think I would talk about mobile network densification or offload. And we've been doing a lot of work with our customers and kind of working out deployment models for that. And I think that the first thing to say is, what is that use case exactly? And I think that the problem statement is, if I'm a mobile network operator and I have a fully loaded macro cell in downtown LA, for example, what do I do? Okay, so I can split the cell and get another macro cell, but where am I going to put that site? So typically you would put a small cell in locations or multiple small cells, and you'll actually see them around the city here. But the challenge there, normally you would use the same frequency that you have for your macro cell for your small cell. And what we're finding as an industry is that it's pretty tough to engineer that in a good way. Because typically either you put that at the edge of your cell to fix your coverage, or if you put that in the middle of your cell to offload coverage, you've really got to tune the parameters between the macro cell and the small cell carefully to get the offload. So it's actually tough to offload your macro cell in a good way. And that's where CBRS OnGo comes in, giving 150 megahertz of kind of right now empty spectrum that you can use for that offload. So we've been working with our customers to be able to work with deployment models where in those small cell locations, which are much more flexible, you have different sites that you can acquire there, that it provides that empty spectrum that provides unique offload to the macro. And then also one of the ingredients for that is making sure you can do carrier aggregation between the CBRS band and the existing license bands. And so getting that to work is a good thing. So we've been doing work on trialing and exercising that facility. The next thing is, the next benefit that it gives you is that it allows, when you aggregate enough of those frequencies, you can get to a gigabit per second service, which is really attractive. You see, if you get to one of those locations, the service is really incredible. And so then you say, okay, well, it's nice to give that level of service, but it's also important for the future. Because as we overlay 5G into a city like LA, for example, you really want your LTE layer to be at that gigabit level. So CBRS not only offloads the macro capacity that you have, it also gives you that gigabit per second layer that gets you ready for 5G. So we've learned a lot in terms of how you deploy the small cells, what frequency combinations you use. One of the things that Gordon mentioned earlier is that CBRS OnGo is superior to LAA as an offload technology. So it's just really proving its worth. So I think that's a really good use case. Another example where we spent a lot of effort is in fixed wireless in a lot of the rural areas. And we've heard today about different fixed wireless operators. But really to prove out the economics, to prove out the deployment methodology, it's quite a lot of work. And we worked with economic models and we looked at the 10 megabits per second services, 25 megabits per second services, and 100 megabit per second services. So what does it cost to deploy and how do you deploy them? How far from my cell site can I generate and deliver 100 megabits per second? What's my oversubscription rate? So we've done a lot of modeling work on that. Also in some of these rural areas, what's the RF terrain look like? We've worked hard on improving our propagation models to give better prediction. And then also you're looking at, okay, what households do I need to cover? And so if you think about what's the user experience of, okay, I call up, I want to get a CBRS OnGo service from a fixed wireless operator, how do you know that I have coverage? And so we're working on propagation tools and modeling and interfacing into customer service systems to provide a simple go, no-go to that subscriber to say, yes, I'm going to get service, it's going to be at this data rate, and I'm going to put my CPE antenna on the front of my house or the back of my house. So a lot of learnings around fixed wireless as well. So that'd be the two use cases that I would offer.
Great, okay.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Rao Yallapragada from Intel Corporation. I'm part of the next generation and standards team, particularly involved with technology and spectrum strategy. My key focus has been CBRS, ultra-reliable, low-latency applications, and then automation in vertical domains. Now, in regards to CBRS and then Intel's involvement, and one thing I have to mention is that Intel has been very involved with CBRS from the inception of the CBRS Alliance in it has great interest to see the CBRS experiment coming to fruition. So, in regards to the CBRS developments, as you can imagine, Intel is a semiconductor organization, so its focus has been the development of silicon. So, in that regard, it has made enormous strides in developing the silicon, both at the user devices end and as well as the network nodes. Now, one thing for the group, as I have to mention, that there are close to 150 radio combinations that have been worked out between CBRS Alliance and 3GPP. So that's a huge one. I mean, and then from our end, great progress has been made in terms of the development of the modems to make sure these combinations work. Now, from that point of view, you can imagine our major interactions, and I should say, has been the mobile service provider, the major mobile service providers. Enormous amount of interest, has been kind of seen from these service providers. So, from that end, so what's going on here? We are seeing that CBRS is going to be used as a supplemental downlink to begin with in the TDD band. Band 48 is going to be combined with several bands. And there is also greater interest in using CBRS as a fundamental, the primary channel. So this work is currently going on, and we are definitely getting ready to kind of, roll out the chips, as early as you can probably see. I think you heard few comments early on from some of the keynote speakers and others. So Intel is kind of greatly behind it. So at the same time, Intel is kind of working on other applications related to IoT in this band. But in terms of its interactions, it has been majorly with the key service providers.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Joel Lindholm. I'm responsible for the LTE business at Ruckus Networks. We're a division of ARIS. Some folks might know them, cable modems and gateways and whatnot. We sit in a fairly interesting space as our classic heritage being Wi-Fi, switching, and now LTE. We service providers, various different kinds, as well as enterprise customers. I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time talking about the enterprise part of the business. I think some of the earlier panels, we talked a lot about neutral host and the need for in-building coverage, and the fact that 80+% of the buildings out there don't have good in-building cellular coverage in them. Certainly we're waiting for handsets and devices, but there's a clear need from every different vertical we talk to in the enterprise space of needing that in-building cellular coverage. So there's an absolutely clear need there, and it spans verticals from housing to hotels to hospitals to carpeted enterprise. It's a general requirement. On the private LTE, however, is a different story, and I thought I'd talk specifically about a use case for one of our industrial customers that has a fairly large property, and that property, today they try and service it with Wi-Fi, and hey, we love selling them Wi-Fi. It's a great product, great technology, but it does have certain limitations to what they can rely on Wi-Fi for. When they think about turning to LTE as being the service levels that it could provide and whatnot, they think about the carriers, and from the problem on that front is that they can't quite rely on the macro coverage from the carriers. You don't know when an adjacent event is going to happen, in which case they'd be sitting there where they're having some mission critical operations trying to run on a wireless network, yet Wi-Fi hasn't gotten what they needed and the macro coverage hasn't serviced them. So we see that the private LTE networks using CBRS is a perfect use case where we can bring them a very high value to their operations. We can start working on devices that are decoupled, if you will, from all the mobile handsets that we're waiting for. And there's a variety of different uses that are benefits to those folks. If you think about a lot of these bigger organizations, they have essentially their own police force that is roaming a property to make sure things are not being intruded on, or people aren't doing things they're not supposed to. They have sensors that they need across a number of different devices to make sure that the equipment is operating as it needs to. You think about the automation that they could be doing with the equipment and driving huge operational efficiencies. We see the benefits of CBRS being able to provide a private network that allows them to do things today that they would not have been able to do before. I obviously live and we get to talk to all these customers, and people always ask, like, where is CBRS going? When is it coming? How are the devices going? And us that live in that game every day, you can sense the wave of attraction of the technology and just the different devices and the different applications. There's a momentum building out there that I think we don't necessarily appreciate is how dominant that's going to become over the next few months here.
Mazen.
Hi everyone, I'm Mazen Chmaytelli with Qualcomm. Qualcomm's been pioneering the effort of having LTE deployed and licensed in unlicensed and shared spectrum, starting initially with LTU and LSA, and moving into LAA, which enabled gigabit LTE deployments globally. We're also co-founders of the CBRS Alliance as well as the Multifier Alliance. Specifically when it comes to CBRS, we're very excited to what the CBRS Alliance has done in the past year in terms of getting us very close to start seeing commercial deployment in the GAA tier. Now, as far as use cases that we've been seeing from our market input, of course, you've seen earlier today Gordon was the AT&T presentation, so one of the first use cases we see is the wireless operators. Being able to basically expand their mobile broadband capacity by augmenting it with CBRS deployments, as well as having indoor coverage covered by deploying CBRS-enabled small cells. Second, you saw Craig from Charter as well talking about the MSO's use cases. And again, that's another capability of having the MSOs leveraging their fixed residential access and position assets in their areas to go ahead and deploy CBRS, similar to what Craig mentioned earlier today. Now, one thing that's also very interesting is having the ability of having industrial IoT deployment. So this is where you have a private LTE network based on CBRS, in which the industrial IoT enterprise being able to control both the small cell deployment as well as the UE devices. So that gives them another route to have this deployment happening in CBRS. I hear a lot of feedback, so sorry about that. It's a microphone. Now, also being Qualcomm and having the luxury of serving both ends of the CBRS ecosystem, so we do sell chipset both on the user devices as well as small cells. We've seen a lot of market interest in CBRS, especially with the upcoming GA deployment. So with that in mind, it's very interesting to see what's coming down the pike and having these use cases deployed commercially.
Okay, Karim.
Hi, so my name is Karim El Malki, I'm the CEO of Athonet. And we're a mobile core network vendor, an EPC vendor, and there have been some discussions earlier about that. Now, EPC, we're a technology provider. We provide technology to service providers, to enterprises who have been deploying it for many years. We have, we've done some of the earliest, smart grid networks, manufacturing and so on in LTE, right? Now, the core network is really, in my view, one of the elephants in the room because it's got to be, especially for CBRS, it's got to be at the right price point. You may already be a service provider with a core network, you may be an enterprise that needs a new one, but it's got to be able to scale and you've got to be able to distribute it right at the right price point. And that's really been one of the fundamental things that we've seen over the years. You have to have all the functionality, you have to have everything that's needed, policing, IMS, everything, but it's got to scale right at the right price point. And that's not an easy thing to do. Because, you've got your CBRS license, you've set up your radios, unless it's got a core network to connect to, it's a problem. And To solve this, what we've done actually right today is that we've launched our mobile core running on the AWS cloud. Now, the important thing here that I want to point to is also the importance of IoT, right? I mean, it's got to scale at the right price point for different services, and IoT is a difficult one to cater for. Now, we've launched this service, which is quite unique because it's tightly integrated also with AWS IoT, which means for a CBRS player, you just need to deploy the radios and it can connect immediately to the cloud core with an edge component, right? An edge component that keeps traffic local. Wherever you need it, be it the enterprise or anyway, the network edge, and keeps the intelligence in the cloud. This is something that for those who are interested, we're demoing and we have at our stand. Now, I really believe that this kind of a game, in this kind of an area, the core network is critical, and if you play it right, you can actually get it to the right functionality, get it to the right level of distribution. We have had a lot of experience with enterprises in deploying this, and we're really excited to be here and as part of the CBRS Alliance to be able to give this technology to everyone interested in deploying CBRS.
Okay, thank you. Well, all right, so I asked the last panel about business models, and I'm going to ask you guys about business models also, because my perception is we have now proven that we have a technology that works. It's about to be launched, and I think a lot of people showed up today because there's a perception that this thing's going to blast off. And the question is, what do we have to change in the business models addressing these new customer groups? You know, we have a lot of companies represented here that are used to selling something to mobile operators that work at a certain cadence and have a certain way of doing business. How does that change as we go into OnGo? Chris, do you want to start there?
Well, I was going to give the other side a chance. You want to start from the other end?
Let's go. Okay, sure.
Start? Okay. Well, I mean, so we believe enterprises are going to be important. We have deployed a lot of networks, and that's going to change the game because it's a totally different way of actually deploying and actually servicing the end customer. It's not a mobile operator. But still, I believe the problem, although it's a different type of customer, the problem remains the same. We see it from one side, of course, we're a mobile core network vendor. And to be able to make it easier for these types of new customers that are coming in, what we did is that, as I mentioned before, we put it on AWS, it's available on AWS Marketplace. You just click and you can get access to it. And that, I think, these kinds of changes to make it easier for these new players to deploy LTE and CBRS is fundamental to OnGo.
Right, so as I discussed earlier, the three different models we've seen. One thing I didn't touch on, which is also important with CBRS will enable, is the neutral host model. And that's basically enabled venue owners to work with the OnGo service provider to go ahead and offer their customers a great LTE experience based on the GA deployment of CBRS. So this is where you'll see some interesting business model happening between the OnGo service provider, the venue operator, as well as the wireless operator, so you could have handoff in between. So I think CBRS is one of these bands that will enable such business models to happen, and of course, looking forward toward 5G and unlocking more spectrum for shared unlicensed cellular application will be key. So we're looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, so I'll go back to depends on the vertical that you're going into, I think, it's very specific. In some cases, in the neutral host model, where you need in-building cellular coverage, you're going to have still have some sort of collaboration between the operator, the venue owner, and maybe some neutral host provider that can go deliver those services. So from that perspective, a lot of the pieces of the puzzle are actually there today, that neutral host operators exist. And the difference is that it likely would be a network that's in the venue and the venue ownership land, as opposed to something that was part of their own macro networks. If you think through that a little bit, it actually is likely a benefit to the operator to not have to go put a whole bunch of different venues on top of their network and have to manage it like they do the rest of the network. So I think we have an opportunity to make it easier to enable the neutral host, but leveraging a lot of the pieces that are there today. When I was talking earlier about a more industrial use case where they want to put a lot of devices on that network. If you were to have gone to them in the past and say LTE, they probably would have run the other way because of the cost of that network. Now it has an opportunity for them to actually deploy an LTE network much like they do a Wi-Fi network today. And so I think that it opens up doors that just didn't exist before. But in those kind of critical applications, they're still going to need somebody to go monitor and manage that network in order to make sure that the operational benefits are there. They're depending critical infrastructure on this network. So you need somebody that's there that's going to sign up to the SLA.
Thank you. I echo these thoughts very much. Let's kind of look into it a little, let's analyze this situation here. So you have multiple verticals very clearly, and when it comes to addressing the mobile service provider use case, where we are looking into aggregating multiple channels and providing greater throughput as a data booster and providing carrier aggregation capabilities, and I don't see much changing in that regard. Okay, that's one thing. So in regards to some of these other use cases, private IoT kind of networks, where you are talking about industrial use cases and then providing other use cases such as low latency applications, and so some of these other use cases you are looking into two things. One is a private IoT, and the other one you're looking into neutral host capabilities. So that's kind of using the enterprise IoT model, an enterprise model basically, and those elements are being put in place now for both LTE as well as 5G. So CBRS can right away play into these models which are kind of currently being worked out for 5G as well as LTE for both of them. That's the way we are kind of seeing it.
Yeah, maybe I'll come at it from a different angle. I think one of the things we're seeing as industry challenge right now is the monetization of IoT. So if you think about it, IoT, you can buy an IoT subscription from a cellular provider for $5 a year. That's not a lot of money. So how do you make enough money from that? Well, the subscriber sees value in the device, in maybe a module, maybe a customized solution, and then application, which maybe in technology terms, relatively simple, two guys in a garage can come up with an application that adds perceived much more value into that. So as an IoT operator, can you survive on that $5 a year per device? Probably not. But then how do you go after each of your segment markets? You need to have vertical expertise. So I think the challenge to address the IoT market is how do I segment, how do I add enough vertical value to be able to make money in the business case? Because connectivity in the IoT world is insufficient.
So I guess the first place I'd start, something that Paul had mentioned the first time we went around was about the fact that we think that the carriers are going to make use of this spectrum. I mean, it clearly gives a boost to the capacity of the networks, and I think you look at that and you look at the fixed wireless access, and those are very traditional models, but I think they're very valuable because I think that's one of the things that OnGo CBRS has done. I think when we talk about trying to do other things that are a little bit more innovative or maybe a little bit out of left field, one of the things that we find is, and again I suppose it speaks a little bit to what was being said before, is that you have to understand the total value chain and how you're going to deliver it. And I think one of the pieces that we said, and maybe to just go back to the comment I made about the utilities, was that there are pieces that became valuable, and as part of that business model became valuable that you could do as add-ons, that you could provide as a service on top of the base platform, that clearly started to create a much bigger pull. I think, though, one of the other things we do see is that some of the more speculative type business models start to demand a much more cloud type approach, a much more pay-as-you-go sort of opportunity, because I think what we see is some of the areas people are going to try, less assured business models, and to do that and to take that risk, they need the support of being able to consume it as they go. So certainly one of the things that we look at is how can we support some of that innovation in a way that sort of helps them take the leap right up front. And part of that is about trying to create more of things in the cloud, more of things that you can consume as a service.
Good stuff. Okay, any questions from the audience? I don't see any, so I'll use our last few minutes and ask one more question about, thinking about the long term. We've been talking today about the U.S. market, obviously, because this is the only place where we have this spectrum. But I have a feeling that a lot of other regulators around the world are watching this experiment and trying to understand how does this work. And assuming that it does work, in the next few months, we're going to start to see other countries picking this up. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether you see any indications of that in the long term. Do you see this phenomenon going worldwide?
So maybe I can start. So we've had a certain amount of outreach from other countries about CBRS and what we're doing with OnGo. I think in the Alliance we spent a little bit of time talking about exactly what we should do about other countries and so on, and I think we always came around to the idea that we should focus on making this a success, because fundamentally it's the success of this will create the other opportunity. But I have seen it. I think there's a number of people, even in the last week, that came to us, and we did some conversations with people based in other countries around how they could actually adopt this model. I think, though, that there's some fundamental pieces in here. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that, as Julie Knapp said, when they started down this path, it wasn't what was done normally. So it took a bit of guts to go start doing this, and it's taken some fortitude to get us to this point. And don't underestimate that same barriers there in other countries, and they look upon this and maybe look upon it and are fascinated as to how successful we can be and how broad an ecosystem and how broad a set of use cases we can generate. But I think they go back and then they have to face their own rules, regulations, and all the other good things that they've got to try and slog through to make something like this happen.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think the first thing is let's keep our eye on the prize of making us successful and getting to mass rollouts, point number one. Point number two is that we have got some specifics. I mean, we have aircraft carrier-borne radar of ships moving around the country. That's a sort of unique kind of experience around the world. So maybe the exact configuration of CBRS isn't directly applicable, but other things are. So for example, as more spectrum gets released, there's going to be more and more incumbents. The spectrum is getting messier and messier. So you have to work around point-to-point microwave or point-to-point links. You have to work around fixed satellite links. I mean, if you look at the millimeter wave spectrum that's being released, there's a lot of incumbents, which means that at a minimum you need some kind of basic way of having exclusion zones. These may be static exclusion zones, but you need database mechanisms to manage that. So I think that's the second point. Third point, there's another phenomena that's coming up, which is something called local licensing, where regulators around the world are saying, well, actually allocating a spectrum license on a national basis, where in big swathes of the country maybe that spectrum owner doesn't use it, isn't the most efficient thing. So why don't we carve out particular areas, rural or particular locations, and give that spectrum to other people? So local licensing is one of the new sort of hot topics for regulators. So we've had a lot of interest in different regulators around the world. The Ofcom, the regulator in the UK, has done white paper work around shared spectrum, so I think we'll see something there. And then Germany, for example, has released 50 megahertz to use for local licensing. So I think we'll see that trend continue, and it's great to see the US being a leader in this shared regulatory approach.
Okay. So it's interesting, this whole experiment, that was kind of given rise in last 10 years ago is kind of coming together. So what we have seen, I mean, I think the industry knows this, this authorized shared access and, shared spectrum usage has been kind of, talked about for years together. And then what we know really from other countries who are watching us, do this, they've kind of viewing this whole thing in a very skeptical way so far. But what a great experiment has come together right now. And I think we see that, like Paul just mentioned about these efforts in Germany and UK, are closely watching what's happening here, and probably are going to use, going to take lessons from this phenomenon that's kind of shaping up. So there's not only just this spectrum that we are kind of looking into from 3.55 to 3.7. There are other pieces of spectrum. So we had some special case where we have military radars and such in the coastline, kind of using the spectrum, and then we are kind of looking into it. There are other pieces of the spectrum all through, where we need to probably kind of take lessons from what we have done and then make use of it. Not only outside US, but within US itself. So great things to move forward, I think.
Yeah, I think the whole model for shared spectrum is just super exciting because, as the, Ruckus, Nokia, Qualcomm, others, and the founding members of the Alliance, had the vision to be able to go and say, one, we have to solve a problem, right? One is the fact that the spectrums and allocation of the spectrum, that it's a complicated mess, and they're not making more spectrum, right? We need to make better use of that spectrum, and that's absolutely what the sharing model enables you to do. Certainly there's complications. We happen to have ships and radar. Other countries have their own dynamics, but the concept of a sharing system, I think, is now being proven here in the US. A year and a half ago, if you were to go to talk to anybody outside the US, or even in the US, they would have said, yeah, I'm not so sure that SaaS model is going to work. I don't hear that anymore. Now I hear people going, hey, that's a pretty innovative thing. Let's go figure out how we can adopt something different. So I think that's a global perspective that people need to go and figure out how to come up with a shared model like this. The other problem that is pretty much everywhere is, mobile operators have a solution for outside a building. I mean, that's the outside-in model, and us driving around, we can use the service without a problem. But inside a building is consistently a problem around the globe as well. So we need to come up with an answer for that. And I think a number of the countries around the globe are starting to look at, okay, how do I leverage either some of the spectrum allocated to enterprise versus carriers, and the shared spectrum model, how can I solve the real problems? One, the lack of spectrum and make it more efficient, and two, how do I solve coverage problems that there are no answers for it today.
Okay, great. Yeah, in addition to my board member colleagues I've mentioned about the international applicability, we at Qualcomm, we see the shared spectrum experience here with CBRS is very important to unleashing more spectrum globally for 5G services, which is very important because if you look at being able to look at fair sharing paradigm and being able to squeeze as much as you can out of that spectrum, you're able to reach fiber-like use cases when it comes to 5G, as well as the ultra-low latencies that speakers earlier talked about. So earlier this year at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, Qualcomm did demo some of these 5G NR capabilities when it comes to sharing fairly in unlicensed spectrum, and some of these new paradigms we're working on right now. We're pushing through 3GPP, so you could see that applicability going forward and enabling a great 5G experience for everyone.
So to add to that, we actually have direct experience in another country where we actually did a shared access trial with the Italian regulator. In this case, it was on a different frequency. It was on 2.3 gigahertz. But we actually deployed, several tests were done, so I can definitely confirm that there's great interest, and all eyes are on this market, on the US, on the Alliance to make it through. And the comment on 5G from Mazen really makes a lot of sense, because there's an obvious adaptation of this to 5G, and how this license sharing can also help there, which can also make it easier because you could use any type of frequency. That again is an important aspect, and we should aim to deploy this as quickly as possible, in fact, to open this road up.
Good stuff. Okay, I know it's time for drinks, so we have time for one rapid fire question here.
Thanks. Rapid fire will be, I just wanted to build on the push that we're sort of seeing internationally
with the success you've seen, I agree with you to focus on making a success domestically first, but it does seem to be the case that other regulators tend to follow suit. There's a ripple effect from what happens in the US. But we did have a very unique and powerful starting point here where we had efforts from inside the Council of Economic Advisors, the government, we had the FCC championing this as well as innovators inside the industry rallying together to get this off the ground. To what extent, as you look internationally, do you need to kind of work outside of the regulatory domain and into the innovation arms of government to try to get them as excited as I suppose the US government was to get this running?
Anyone want to handle that one?
Well, I guess I'm probably not a direct answer to it, but we always thought there were certain ingredients that would make this a success, okay? Scale is definitely one of them. You need to have an ecosystem that develops around it. I think if you were to unlock certain spectrum in another country and you couldn't get the buy-in, as you see here, from device manufacturers, the CBSDs and so on, then I don't think you achieve anything. And I mean, scale was definitely one of the things that we wanted to get in. We wanted to bring in this concept of exclusivity, which meant or inclusivity, sorry, which meant that it wasn't just good for new operators or new ideas, but it was really good for the guys that are out there and have got networks. So I think there were certain ingredients, and when we get to the end of this, I'm sure that you'll be able to distill what those were that made this a success. But I think that's what you've got to repeat elsewhere. You've got to try and get that basket of things that create the success.
But I think it will happen naturally in a way, because insatiable demand for more spectrum means, so where do I go and get that spectrum? So typically, like federal users occupy most of the spectrum in most countries. And so if you ask a federal user, do you want to give it up or share it? They're probably going to say share it. So I think the logic is there that it will continue, and will provide good leadership in that area.
Before I talk about the success, right, I think we are still there, at the precipice, let me put it this way. This is like deviation from the norm that we've been used to for the last 20, more than 30 years right now. So the use of, another new agency like SAS to kind of, figure the allocation of spectrum, usage of, the resources, coexistence of users and operators, and this is a major problem that we are kind of dealing with. So I think there is some more distance to go. I think before we can start kind of using the word success, but we're definitely there in that phase. But what I'm trying to emphasize is, those fundamentals have to be, has to kind of go to the ground, and then it needs to be proven. So that's what we are going to, watch out. Should be watching out in the next few months to, next few months to a year.
Yeah, I think, Chris probably mentioned the collaboration that was here in the US between cable operators, mobile operators, equipment manufacturers, chip manufacturers, the regulatory agencies, that cross-collaboration is maybe a bit of a unique environment that we may not see in other places. However, it does give kind of a nucleus of things that do have to happen. I know in some countries they have, the mobile operators themselves are saying, hey, I've got spectrum here, I can reallocate it, I can do this, and they have problems that they do need to solve. So, I think the lessons learned, the demonstration, I'm planning on success in the near future here, is going to be that leadership that gives people the foresight, and maybe they're willing to make some changes that they wouldn't have done before. So I think it's pretty phenomenal that the Alliance has come as far as it has, and seemingly on a road to success.
Yeah, I echo mostly what's been said so far. Really the goal here from Alliance leadership is to go ahead and push us through the goal line, and we're working hard on that.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's not been such a strong sort of group of companies that have been pushing this in other countries, and they should be. So you have a very good point.
All right, let's give our panel a round of applause.